Welcome to Dialogue, a true crime conversation, and today it's really emphasis on the true crime. I'm your host, Rebecca Sebastian, and we are moving along in our series on true crime authors. And today I am speaking to a longtime veteran crime reporter journalist, Mike Watkiss. Mike was introduced to me by my past guest and now friend, Kirk Nurmi. If you have not listened to my episode with Kirk, you should go back to season 1. Episode 43, it was in May of 2020. I'm looking at my website right now. I don't actually remember the month that it was. I had to look for reference. But great conversation. Kirk's a great guy. So when he suggested I speak to Mike, I said I'll speak to Mike. And I'm so glad I did. Mike was there for so many of the high-profile cases you've watched over the years, and he talks about them and kind of his approach to reporting, which is very old school, and I'm going to let him tell you more about it, but he has a book out called Story Hustler, Murder, Mayhem, and PTSD, and we get all into it. Particularly the takeaway for me, you know how a lot of us on Dialogue talk about where were you when the OJ verdict was read? Well, Mike can tell you where he was when the crime scene tape was going up. Okay, so he was very proximate to that story in the very, very early beginnings. And it's a great story because he tells you about who he saw coming and going on that crime scene, and I'm going to let him tell you all about it. But before I get right into our conversation, I would like to direct your attention to a link in the show notes. It's to a Google survey, and I would be so grateful if you took a few minutes to take the survey. And I really, really want to know what listeners appreciate about Dialogue, maybe some of the things they don't love about Dialogue, who you want to hear from on the podcast, and everything in between. So I'm not trying to make you feel bad, but I took a lot of time to write the survey, and I, pour my heart into every conversation I have, and I just want to make the show better and better. So if you're a listener, if you've listened once, twice, or 70 times, I would just be profoundly grateful if you could take 5 minutes, take the survey. It's anonymous. Your email is not captured. I will not know who wrote what. I will just get these as, a Google form filled out anonymously. You're not being added to a mailing list, though. If you want to do that, please go to RebeccaSebastian.com, and there's a sign up there. I would love to have you join. But that is not what this is about. This is honestly about constructive criticism, encouraging words, what you really like about the show, which guests really resonated, segments you want to see, bonus content you might want, all of it. I'm mapping things out further in advance than I have in the past. This will really help me shape the show that you want to hear. I love doing the show in all its forms, but I love it more when you're enjoying it with me. So please take a few minutes and fill that out. I'd be so grateful. You can find that link in the show notes. Now, back to the reason you came. Let's move the conversation back into a very, very true crime conversation space with Mike Watkiss. We really kill the small talk and get right into it. Thank you, Mike, so much for being on Dialogue Podcast. Mike Watkiss, welcome to Dialogue Podcast. I'm very excited to meet you in person and speak with you today.
Well, it's very kind of you to extend this invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Likewise, and we have to give a little shout out to our mutual friend, Kirk Nurmi, who facilitated the invitation.
A good friend of mine and a guy that I've known for many years, and he has been through a whole lot in his life journey, and I'm glad that he's having a platform now to talk about this second act in his life. Yes, he's a very interesting guy.
He really is, and that's a great way to put it, especially given his propensity to get on stage now and share it, in his various creative ways. So I'm happy for him.
I think all lawyers are sort of showboats at heart. So he's letting the inner thespian out, I think.
Good call. I think there's crossover actors and lawyers. I think they're cut from a similar cloth.
No doubt.
Well, you actually are, there's a bit of not performance to your work as a reporter, but you certainly have a flair and a style that people have talked about and noticed. So you are a veteran journalist and crime reporter. And I thought it was so interesting when I read that you studied anthropology and then went on to study journalism at Columbia, which is amazing, dream school. And Stanford is undergrad. So you've done your work, but have you just always been fascinated by people? Is that what made you become a storyteller?
Well, as the whole Columbia journalism thing, I tell people that I am a classically trained musician who preferred to play rock and roll. So that, and I was real lucky. I had a great education and was fortunate to stumble through those. And it's not like I was a star student at any of those institutions, but I made them through. And it was studying anthropology, I think, was really the foundation of what I do today. We used to study this unit of anthropology called an ethnography, where you went and studied a unique community and what that community really did as an organism to stay alive. And that sort of thinking has, I think, infused much of my reporting, certainly in regards to the FLDS community and the community of Warren Jeffs, which has occupied much of my attention throughout my career.
Yeah, much of your attention and a lot of work, a lot of years and time spent there. And now your family kind of culturally comes from a Mormon background, though not devout or practicing. So did that inform your interest in that story, or is that circumstantial?
No, I think that, I think that's the kind of story that you can really tell in a context and in the history if you know it. I came and really started focusing on that story. Well, it's been 40 years. And I think it is because I sort of, I felt like I had some understanding of the culture that then allows for this sort of morphing into cults and the abuse of women and children. And what we saw, unfold in Colorado City, I knew it was there, and somebody who I think knew it was there and knew how to go find it needed to tell that story.
So what do you attribute that to the to cults having this kind of propensity and this like rife environment for that abuse? Is it the secrecy?
Well, all of the things that you would think about as a cult: secrecy, isolation, the constant drumbeat that the outside world is evil and they're all going to kill us, and you have to have an enemy to have an us like that. And I think that, certainly the Warren Jeffs community, the FLDS community, which has changed significantly over time. Those communities have shown there have been real growth, and they're much more open today. And I'm really pleased to see that. But certainly I think that the Jeffs, I've covered a number of cult leaders over the years. Jeffs, the biggest body of followers for sure, but there have been a lot of smaller guys along the way, and there are similarities in all of them. The drumbeat that we have the absolute truth, and the outside world is evil, and we need to barricade ourselves away. And there are themes that you see from Koresh to smaller guys, fundamentalist Mormon guys like a fellow named Arvin Shreve, to a big grandiose prophet like Warren Jeffs. Many similarities.
I'm actually really fascinated by cults. It's probably my favorite subgenre of true crime. And I have a theory that some people find super weird. Other people think it might be okay. But I'm curious what your take on this is with cult leaders. I sometimes see a lot of similarities between a cult leader and, say, just a really charismatic, successful artist, business leader, politician.
Sure.
I think there's some attributes that you could, assign both ways.
Yeah.
Charles
I would not
Manson.
argue with any of that.
Okay. Like Charlie Manson, for example, I think was just a really frustrated artist and turned really dark. I know he really, did horrible, horrible things, but I wonder if his career hadn't been on the up and up musically, like it seemed like it was going, could things have looked really different?
Oh, I think I wouldn't argue with any of that. Sure, people have different turns in life. We've been speaking, and certainly a lot of people have been watching this Ramirez a show on television. Really an extraordinary piece of work. But I had some contact with Richard, and everybody wants to sort of certainly with a guy like Richard to say this is the devil. And
Yeah.
I would argue that I think that it's easy to put pigeonhole, and it makes us all feel better when we can say this guy's the devil. Knowing Richard as I do, that there was a whole backstory that led this guy, and I in no way want to come off as some sort of groupie or defender of, I had a very bristly interview with Richard one time, so it's not like I had a great deal of sympathy for this guy, and that was on display in this interview. But the bottom line is, I think when people say I looked into his eyes and I saw the devil, I don't question that that's their feeling, but was not my impression. I looked at him, you're a really messed up young man.
Yeah.
And if you're talking about what his backstory, and it was, divorce it from everything we knew happened in Los Angeles and then on. If you just looked at the backstory, you'd say, this is going to turn out to be a profoundly damaged adult.
Yeah.
The question is merely degree, and people are going to say, well, a lot of people have hard backgrounds and they don't end up killing people, and they're absolutely correct. But a guy like Ramirez, I think, there's a lot to what got him to the point where I was sitting across a little still table talking to him in a San Francisco jail. And I think so. It's interesting, and people, I think, should be discussing the very topics and theories that you're promoting.
Yeah, that's so interesting to hear you talk about that. And let's talk about that interview a little bit, just because everybody is watching the Netflix show right now about Ramirez.
Right.
I watched your interview with him. You're definitely not a groupie. You're definitely not even, treating him with kid gloves. But can you set that context? Like, remind me what year that was. How long had he been in prison?
Oh,
and
you're going to ask me these hard questions.
I know, sorry.
Dates. All I can tell you is that the murder spree in Southern California, in the Bay Area, had concluded. Yeah. Richard had been in custody for a very long time. When I got sucked into the freak show, Richard had already been convicted of 13 of the most heinous murders California had ever seen. He'd already been convicted of those in a trial in Los Angeles. He had now been shipped up to a county jail in San Francisco to await trial for the murder and assault of a couple up in the Bay Area, Peter Pan and Barbara Pan.
Yes.
They were some of the last victims of Richard. And so he's convicted. He's awaiting trial for the Pan matter up in San Francisco. And that's where I got access to him. And we did that rather feisty interview.
Yeah. You didn't jab, but you challenged him and how he was responding. But I'm just curious about the room. Like, what's the energy like? Who guides you in there? How many people are watching? Were you nervous? I mean,
the setting was, I would say that I have done a lot of jail/prison interviews with a number of bad or, murderers, killers, and, serial and otherwise. And this was in the days of yore. It was there were guards. And I was inside that jail a couple of times, and I can just tell you, I think in the post 9/11 crazy world, the security in all facilities like that are radically different. But this was surprisingly sort of casual. We were in a very small room. It was just Richard and I. My camera guy is sitting sort of in the doorway because there was no room in the actual room itself for him to situate. And there were a couple of guards standing around. Richard was not cuffed. We were sort of just, as you and I, if we were sitting across from a little metal table in a tiny little concrete cubicle, that's what it was like.
Wow. That's really intense. And I'm with you on the evil thing. I think that's something maybe we do when we just want to explain the inexplicable.
Yeah.
And it's hard because we know of people and can point to examples of people who've had hard childhoods and adversity and have grown up not to kill others. We just have to ascribe something to that, right? But I didn't get so much evil as like certainly dark, but little smugness on his part. And then, you kept saying you're very good at reading your responses. Did he actually have a paper that he was like looking at, or was it sort of him trying to remember his script?
No, Richard came in with a little manifesto with bullet points that he clearly wanted to. This was, I believe, it was the first time he had spoken in an interview setting, and it was clear. Watching that documentary made me on Netflix made me think of something. In many ways, I think Richard came into my interview wanting to do what he had done at those crime scenes. He wanted to paint his pentagram on the interview. He wanted to put out his bullet points, and I would, I'm not in no way educated to make these diagnoses, but I'd say that Richard was quite a smart young man. I bet if tested, he had a fairly high IQ. Profoundly damaged, immensely insecure, pompous, arrogant, covering that insecurity up. And he came in with that, a head of steam, and he had some bullet points, and he was going to say them no matter what I asked him. Yeah. So it degenerated pretty quickly with Richard staying to his bullet points and me trying to want to, get some communication going, get a little back and forth going. And I will not deny that it was not one of my better interviews. Again, I've interviewed a number of killers. Some I've done a better job at. But I went in sort of ticked off. I had just spent time with one of Richard's victims, a man, classic MO of Ramirez. He snuck into a young couple's home in the middle of the night, shot the man multiple times in the head, then savagely raped and abused the woman before robbing them and leaving. The guy survived, but they pulled a couple of bullets out of his head, but he was left with a bullet in the brain, severe brain trauma. This was, again, one of Richard's victims, and I went and spent some time with him at a home for people with traumatic brain injuries where he was living. His family was visiting him at the time, and he was a lovely guy. So I sort of carried, I maybe a little bit of him with me into that interview, thinking of this sweet man whose life had been ruined by Richard. So that way, I got to confess, I probably shouldn't have had as many cups of coffee before for that interview.
Well, I mean, he didn't make for an easy subject, and I guess why would Richard Ramirez be an easy subject? But I guess I'm being a little selfish now because I'm an amateur interviewer on my podcast, but I am curious, how do you know when an interview is going well, when it's not, and how do you like re-steer the ship if you feel like it's getting away from you or if you need to change tactics?
Those are challenging questions that I've been struggling with during my 40-year career. I think you go in. I mean, that certainly was an interview that taught me just to, I think, let them talk. And I guess it depends on if you're going in, what your mindset is on an interview going in. If you're going in where you're doing some investigative story where you have pretty good sense in your heart and your head that somebody's a bad person, you go after them and let it fly. But if you're interviewing, or do you want the public to have a moment to just really understand who this human being is, get out of the way of the interview. So, I mean, every interview requires a different approach, whether you're ambushing some gangster in the street, interviewing a serial killer, or a grieving family member who had just lost a loved one. I mean, the approach is different on everyone.
So which do you look back on and feel, or which ones stand out and do you feel very proud of, both your contribution and also, maybe gratitude for how the subject was, but which really kind of made a mark on you that you go back to all the time?
Interviews or stories? Are you talking about?
I guess I meant interviews, but let's hear both.
Well, Richard is certainly the most famous, and I think on that topic, the documentary on Netflix, the one thing, it's a fabulous story about those two wonderful cops,
Yes.
Bill and Frank. Amazing guys, and that is an amazing story. But it still left me wanting a little bit on who's Ramirez. I mean, went through the entire the catalog of these grisly homicides and these two extraordinary men finding him. But I think that speaks to sort of what an enigma this guy is, and why we're looking back on. There's not a lot of him talking on camera, not like Charlie Manson or or Ted Bundy even, where these guys seem to just love to run the mouth. Richard was very guarded when he spoke to me. I mean, that's why I think he liked hiding behind the bullet points. He didn't want to talk about his childhood. He didn't want to talk about anything personal. And I thought that was fascinating and telling in and of itself. But in terms of the stories, the work I'm most proud of, there's no doubt about it. It's I think helping corral Warren Jeffs into a prison down in the Lone Star State of Texas. We certainly had a hand in chasing him down into that prison cell. That's the work I'm most proud of. But there's a million. They're little interviews. I mean, one time I was with a cameraman early in my career. We're driving to some other story in a remote part of Utah, and we see a man and a little boy in a covered wagon on the side of a modern freeway, driving along in a horse-drawn covered wagon that they'd obviously made. We said, if those guys are still there when we finish this other story, we got to stop and go back and interview them. Yeah. Stopped and interviewed this wonderful man and his son, who were basically living off the land way before that was cool. And that's one of my favorite stories of all time, because it was a father's love for his son. And being a dad, it has spoken to me throughout my career. And that may be my favorite story of all time. And I probably did in the first 18 months of my career.
And it was just an unexpected, you were curious about it and you stayed with it.
Yeah, and it was a lovely man. And, and that's a theme that I have seen throughout being a dad. I see how important a father figure can be in a child's life, and how the absence or, a bad father, how detrimental that can be to a kid. And and so that has spoken to me, and that has been sort of a part in my heart throughout most of my career. People abusing children, and our fathers who step up or don't step up. Those have always spoken to me. Yeah.
Well, speaking of family, it seems you come from there's a couple lawyers in the immediate family.
A million lawyers in the extended family.
Really?
Yeah,
okay.
I wasn't smart enough to go to law school, so I dispensed with that early on.
I don't know if I'm going to agree with that, but how did they view your career and what you decided to do?
Yeah, well, I hope I hope they don't think I'm too much of an embarrassment. I have brothers who are lawyers. My wife is an attorney. My father was quite a well-known attorney back, but as far as my career choice, the interesting thing is my father, who I had great respect for and was quite a distinguished attorney of his generation, he always said if he could do it over again, he would have been one of Edward R. Murrow's young reporters covering the war. So in many ways, it may be fulfilling his dream. And I in no way compare my career to Edward R. Murrow. It's on a very I'm rock and roll, and he was a symphony. But
well, you do have an award though with his. You do have an award under that name, don't you?
I actually have been lucky enough to, and they're probably. I've never really been a big pursuer of hardware, but I got a couple of Edward R. Murrow awards, and I'm very
pretty cool.
And they're both related to the Warren Jeffs FLDS coverage. So I'm pleased with that. I'm grateful and humbled by that.
Rightly so. So would you say a current affair is where things really took off for you? And I think this is interesting because a current affair to me is sort of like that original infotainment, news meets crime hour-long program. Was it?
We were the original television bad boys. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful place to work. I was working as a young a young TV reporter in my hometown, Salt Lake City, when I got a call out of nowhere that said, these guys want to come talk to you. I'd never heard of the show. It was being syndicated and not reached the Salt Lake market yet. So I flew back to New York and met these crazy Australians and some other nut jobs who were running that show. And I was thinking, I'm either getting punked or this is a really good job offer, but I'm not sure. Long and the short of it is I ended up getting fired from my job in Salt Lake City, which necessitated me taking the job at A Current Affair, and it changed my life. And it was been fired from most of the jobs I ever had, and it's always worked out well. So
sometimes things have a way of working out for you, even in the most harsh way.
I think anybody who's worth their salt has probably been fired 2 or 3 times.
I love that. I feel like I've done something wrong now. But there's still
You're
time.
Young. You're still young.
There's still time. Yeah. I can, big dreams. Mom will be so proud. That's the new goal. So talk about the perception of A Current Affair in its prime. Did other news outlets revere it as a source? And then
they hated us and plugged their nose and said, who are these awful people suddenly showing up at the stories? I think that, it was great fun back in the days with Maury Povich and the crazy cast, and there was some wonderful journalists. I mean, I did some of the best work I've ever done working for A Current Affair. I also did the crappiest, the lousiest that I'm most embarrassed about. So it was really, it was both ends of the spectrum, but it was great fun. I spent a couple of years in their New York office and then got sent out to Los Angeles to run this little outpost, this renegade outpost bureau in Los Angeles. Most of the show was in New York, so it was just a bunch of crazies. And I was, I guess, technically the bureau chief, but I wasn't responsible for myself. So it ran itself. We had some great people. And in rapid succession, when I got sent out to LA, we had the O.J. Simpson case. We had the Michael Jackson scandal. We had Tanya Harding. We had Hollywood Madam Heidi Fleiss. It was tabloid nirvana.
Right.
We had so many big stories. And it really was, the craziest part of my career.
No,
because of rapid succession, just so many headline grabbing,
that was like the zeitgeist at that time. Those trials are what you remember from that time period. Now, do you think there was a shift in journalism at that time when these outlets that were looking down on A Current Affair are going, well, this is where the interest is. This is where the audience is. Like, we're also going to cover these cases.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I mean, I think initially, and I tell the story, I've been, as part of it. So it's sort of part of my shtick now, telling how they didn't like us. And they didn't. I think that initially, I got pulled out of this ABC affiliate in Salt Lake City and thought, I was a very serious journalist. And then suddenly I'm doing this stuff, with A Current Affair. But like I say, I was allowed to do some of the best stuff I've ever done working for that show. But initially, there was people plugging their nose and say, "Who are these guys? They're the ruination of American television." And then there were a couple of events like OJ and Tanya Harding, where it was like everybody was suddenly on board with the tabloid train. Right. We were, and I saw that over time, they hated us, but we were successful, and we were starting to, get some audience and get some sizzle and some headlines. And so suddenly, when I would be the only guy showing up there at a story, suddenly one of the network guys was said, so they sort of gradually, plugged their nose, but said this is going to happen. And OJ changed really the face of broadcasting.
Yeah.
In terms of cable news. And Tanya was really the moment when I got the sense that up in Portland, when the Tanya Harding case was unfolding, and I'm standing side by side with Connie Chung and, a young upcomer from NBC News. And I'm thinking, they've thrown in the towel. They realize, they got to cover the story just like we do.
Right. So you were early on site for Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman's murders, for covering those. When did you find your way into the story with OJ in the investigation?
Well, it was the morning that they found the bodies. We were
Whoa.
racing. I write about this in my book. We were racing out a story in Santa Monica from downtown LA early in the morning. Can't remember what the story was, but I get a frantic phone call saying, "Get to this address on Bundy." And it involves OJ. And no, the source, the guy at my assignment desk, didn't know exactly, but it was early in the morning. They'd found the bodies late that night. OJ had gotten on the airplane, and early AM we just were, and so we're on the freeway. Get this phone call, one of those old brick telephones back in the day, and to get off and go to this address. And so we pull up. We're one of the first TV crews. It's LA, so there are a couple of crews there, and just a huge crime scene. And it's, and the bodies of Ron and Nicole were just beyond the tape. And so began the trial of the century.
I am so pleased to tell you that today's episode is brought to you by Kind Bar. True story, Kind Bars are the only bars I can eat or tolerate. They're the only ones that taste good to me, and I love what they're about, and they're doing something really cool with a new initiative that I want to tell you about today on Dialogue. Kind is deeply committed to crafting food with real, recognizable ingredients, a disruptive notion that sparked the creation of a new healthy snacking category. Kind is unapologetic in their efforts to challenge the status quo, to shift the food industry, and empower their community and our listeners to make better, informed choices about health. Kindness can be a transformative force for good, and that is why Dialogue is teaming up with Kind and Podgo to bring our listeners 10 or 15% off for military, teachers, students, first responders, doctors, and nurses. How cool is that? Go to podgo.co/kind. That's podgo.co/kind, KIND. Kind Bar, creating a kinder and healthier world, one act, one snack at a time.
Thank you for listening to this fantastic show on the Crawlspace Media Network.
We want to talk to you about another show on the Crawlspace Media Network.
You got to subscribe to Crawlspace. Crawlspace is a true crime and mystery podcast hosted by the creators of Missing Maura Murray, which happens to be us.
That's right, Tim. It's you and I. We also host Crawlspace. It runs the gamut of the true crime genre, and we try to apply our deep dive investigative techniques into cold cases and missing person cases like Brianna Maitland, Brandon Lawson. We also discuss the mystery of Suitcase Jane Doe, the Colonial Parkway murders, and a number of other cold cases, mysteries, and just strange occurrences.
And we also converse with experts in the field of criminal psychology, law enforcement, and crime media. Want to know how to catch a liar? Or what it's like to wear a wire and get a confession from a juror in your son's wrongful murder conviction?
Crawlspace has it. Want to know what it's like to escape a serial killer just by happenstance? We got that too. So go ahead and check out Crawlspace, subscribe to it on your favorite podcast app right now. There's no reason to wait. Do it now. Now.
So what's your strategy then? What is the first thing you do? We have so much knowledge of that case, the investigation, everything, in 2020. And by 2020, I mean looking back, hindsight, not the year. What was your first move?
They talk about in law enforcement, your training kicks in. As soon as I got out of the car, I was with a veteran crew. I knew those guys were going to go start spraying the B-roll that I needed. And I started doing what I do. I went and started prowling around the crime scene, trying to find anybody that could tell me something. Because at that point, or in those early moments, we knew it involved OJ and an ex-wife or an ex-girlfriend. That's how unspecific we were. This is the info I was running, and another guy. And we didn't know who any of these people were. So I'm sniffing around the periphery of the crime scene, trying to get a couple other old reporters that I go swap some tales with and try to figure out who the players are, who's the agency, and it was right about then when I saw a woman walking very directly towards the crime tape with purpose. Well, and there's lots of old cops and, people hanging around. She wasn't what you'd figure was going to, and she's coming right towards me. I knew with that kind of intensity, she was either working the scene or she was a family member, could have been anything. And she goes whipping past me, and just to slow her down, I said, "Miss, do you have a light?" She sort of snarls at me and she says, "I don't smoke." She ducked under the crime tape and it went and started talking to the cops, and it was Marcia Clark making her entrance.
Wow.
And so it was the early, and she, you come to find out that she had been dispatched from it. And she was one of the first people I sort of noticed coming at it like she had a mission.
Yeah.
So you cue in on stuff like that. And so that's what we were doing, and shooting B-roll. And later in the day, we end up down at LA Police Headquarters because they brought OJ back from Chicago, and by that time the games had begun.
And how did he appear when you got your first glimpse of him in person? Like right, shell-shocked.
Yeah. Again, these are in this is all in that first day, which was really an amazing moment. Again, something I write in some detail about. But after the bodies, the crime scene, and recognizing that OJ's mansion is a short distance away, sort of checking out those two scenes as crowds start to develop and police tape goes up, we get word that OJ had gone to Chicago early in the morning and had now gotten on a plane and come back to LA, and he was being interviewed by cops down at Parker Center down at LAPD headquarters. So we hightail it down there and hang out for a while. Big crowd of reporters finally show up. It's a gag. I mean, it is a complete cluster. Lots of cameras. And OJ, his lawyer at the time comes out the doors and said, "OJ's inside, but he's not going to say anything to you guys. I know you got questions." Sort of a detour for us. And suddenly OJ comes out the door like the running back he is, but he's terrified. Mm-hmm. In those early moments, I don't think the story was straight. He didn't have the dream team together, and there was that moment of just complete. The big tough quarterback was scared to death,
vulnerable,
and that was just, again, my perception in that moment. But he took off, and the case developed and his defense developed. And again, the story unfolded as we know, and ultimately became what we know. I tell people I covered the trial of the century last century. I'm hoping I hang on long enough to catch a little piece of the action this century.
Yes. Yeah, here's to hoping. Almost every guest I've spoken to can recall where they were when the reading of that verdict came in. And it's fascinating to speak to someone who can recall where they were the morning of the murder, because of your proximity. And it leads me to wonder, your approach with more sensitive subjects like family members. Let's say, I don't know, did you speak to Nicole Brown's family or Ron Goldman's family? And how do you do that sensitively and prioritize getting the story, but understand their state of mind? What's your approach there?
Well, I can tell you that I know Fred Goldman and Denise Brown, and like them both very much, and would, I hope, consider them friends. So, yeah, I've interviewed both of them a number of times, and I learned, in terms of interviewing family members, I learned a very interesting lesson some years ago. I would go and speak with a group called the Parents of Murdered Children. Mm. They say that they are the group that no one ever wants to be a member of. Yeah. And there's a local chapter here in Phoenix, and I have been invited to talk with them on a number of occasions about the media. And every time a couple of times I've gone there, I've learned a really profound lesson. They've gone around to the families talking about their loved one and what happened, the circumstances, where the case is now. And there's a dozen, families there, and it's quite heartbreaking. Several of them will tell you, "Oh, the media did a horrible job. They got it wrong. How dare you guys show up at my house?" And then some people say, "Oh, thanks to the media, we got some resolution." I mean, and some didn't have any impact at all. But I got to the end, and a family sort of looked at me and said, "Our child was murdered, and no one ever came and asked us about it." And it told me something as a reporter, if I'm going to cover that story, I have an obligation to extend a hand to them if they want, because some people feel, and I've interviewed plenty of families where you go, oh, I'd love to tell you about what happened. Some, get out of here, get off my property. As a reporter, if these are among the victims, that's what you do. You go to them as gently as you can. You say, I'm here. If you want me to go away, I will go away, but I'm here to hear what you had to say if you want to say something. And if they tell me to get the hell off their property, and turn the dogs on me, which they have, I understand, but I feel like I have done my due diligence, because I don't want to miss that family who says, why didn't you give a damn about my kid?
Right.
Yeah. I can't tell you how meaningful that is. So, those are the most uncomfortable door knocks you'll ever do. I've done 1,000 of them. And I hope you go up with sincerity and you say, if you want me to go away, I'll go away. But if you'd like to say something, I'm here to listen.
That really resonates, and I think it would have a week ago, but I just 2 days ago spoke to a Ted Bundy survivor, and she didn't tell her story for decades. And it's because nobody...
Is she from Salt Lake City?
No, she's from Florida.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
From that case of it, yeah.
So she actually was the second to last attack. And she just said she finally got a call from, I think, 2020 or something. And she said, where have you been? Like, I've been wanting to tell my story. And I thought that is so interesting, because in my mind, I would think it's a sign of respect, maybe, that reporters don't go banging down her door. But you could also feel very unseen and very forgotten, especially as a survivor.
Yeah, right. And I think that's exactly the same sort of reaction. This grieving elderly mother and father who had lost their child, and so it's everybody has a story.
Yes.
People in those positions are not obliged to tell them.
Absolutely.
But we should. But I just found it in my own heart. I can justify going and making that door knock if I try to be as civil and just let them know first and foremost. Do you want me out of here? I'm gone.
Yeah.
But if you'd like to talk, I'd love to talk.
Did anybody ever change their mind and say no and then come back to you?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. And I think there are people who'd said yes and then changed their mind and said no to run the damn thing, or I'm gonna. Yeah. Right. So I had all of those things happen.
Okay.
Thank goodness it doesn't happen a lot, but
Yeah.
Sure.
Humans, it's hard. So we've gotten ahead of ourselves. We've heard all these amazing stories, which of course are all stories, some of which are going to be in your book, which is called Story Hustler, which is an excellent title. But the
Thank you.
Subtitle, Murder, Mayhem, and PTSD. So the murder, the mayhem, I get. Is the PTSD yours? Is it collective? What are you referring to there?
Yeah. As I say in the open of the book, much of it was sort of a do-it-yourself exorcism. A lot of this were in fact demons that I just wanted to get off my soul. Whether it is, and I dedicate the book to my two children because I felt like I certainly don't deserve their forgiveness, but I would like to offer them some explanation on why their dad was such a crazy father. Because when you spend your life, I have come to realize when you spend your life almost every day going and surrounding yourself by bad things and bad stories that hurt people, I know that it takes a toll, and I think the way I realized it most profoundly was the way. I mean, my children are in their 20s now. I still go out to the end of the driveway and tell them to be safe and buckle up. It's made me a crazy sort of hovering father, and so in many ways, I wrote the book to kids. This is why Dad's so crazy.
Right. So, how did you sort of flip the switch when you were home? Did you compartmentalize?
Yeah, I get. No, for sure not. But I just have a really wonderful family.
Good. I mean, that'll get you through a lot.
Really beautiful family.
So you told me a bit offline about the writing process. You've done on-camera reporting for so long, and you even shaped the stories on video. You've got, you had a video editor your whole time, but sometimes you helped craft them that way. What was it like writing the stories?
I looked at it as my basic function. I'm not I'm profoundly dyslexic,
Oh,
which has made my life sort of interesting. So, but I don't look at that as I think you just sort of wire yourself differently.
sure.
If you, so, the storytelling. And I write to talk. I mean, some people have written, I was talking about my book, and they say that they could hear me saying it as they're reading the book. And I guess that's the best thing I could hear, because I have never written to be read. So this book was a challenge for me. I've never written to be read. I've written to be heard.
Yeah, it's a different.
And it's sort of a different thing. So and I'm sure that the book is not for everyone. It's people have said it's a little disjointed and a little chaotic, and and that's probably reflective of the truth.
Yeah, I think you could get away with saying it's by design, even if it wasn't, because if it's reflecting your career,
it makes it sound so much better if I did.
I don't know. If I was your PR team, I might say that, but yeah, because I mean that's maybe what your career has been. It's been erratic, maybe. I don't know. What other words would you use?
Erratic. Let me tell you, a lot worse things have been said. So you can say whatever you'd like.
So I'd love to also hear about the friend we share in common, Kirk Nermes. I assume you met covering the Jodi Arias case,
right?
And where
I
was
was aware of him. He was an attorney here in town, so I certainly was aware of him prior to the Arias case. But that's when I got best acquainted with Kirk.
And so, where does that case kind of factor into your career? And what are your remaining thoughts on that one? Because it really, truly was a crazy one.
Yeah, I have written. There's an extensive chapter in the book about the Arias matter and the prosecutor, Mr. Martinez. I have said on a number of occasions that it's the single worst criminal prosecution that I have ever personally witnessed.
Wow!
It was a mess. It was a mess. Yeah, it was a disaster. My theory and perspective on the case is probably not what many of the mainstream sort of Arias groupies would agree. I just think it was a disaster. It was a horrible waste of money. I think the prosecutor, who is now no longer able to practice law, and rightfully so. And I would have said that prior to the Arias matter, because I've covered other trials that he was involved in, but and the judge had no control over the case, and Jodi is crazy, and so you throw that mix in, and it was a disaster that dragged on for nearly 18 months and cost this county a fortune.
Yeah, I think I read at the end of it, because there was the mistrial and then the aftermath. I mean, Kirk was involved for 5 years. I think it was something like $3 million it cost.
I think that the defense's costs were $6 million. To my understanding, Kurt can correct me, but my understanding, the county ponied up about $6 million, and the county attorney never gave a good accounting for what the state spent, saying, oh, well, it's just part of our annual budget. I can tell you that was not just part of their annual budget. So we spent $6 million to defend her. We spent a lot more and in addition to that, to prosecute her. And they ended up not. The one thing that they wanted the only thing that Martinez was trying to get was a death penalty.
Right. Do you think that was the biggest misstep? Was just coming out the gate with that charge that complicated the whole thing?
I think that they recognized early on, and the story in my book, I think, talks about there was an early realization that this was going to be a big, high profile, and I say a sexy trial on the part of the prosecutors, and they sort of whipped it up beforehand.
Yeah.
And so I think that there are horrible domestic crimes all the time. They're usually committed by men against women. Let's be realistic. This was unique. This was unusual in that regard. But I have covered domestic violence. More heinous, and that was a grisly crime that never get any attention. So there were many factors that played into this getting as much attention as it did. And at the end of the day, the state spent a lot of money to put her on death row, and they failed.
Yeah, you're touching on something I bring up a lot on Dialogue, which is why do some cases rise to the surface of interest versus others. And I think you touched on, I mean, she was an outlier being a female. There were some like salacious details. People like that. What else do you
I
attribute?
would not just having sort of been a tabloid producer, I would not just pass over the salacious details. You know, the salacious details are what made this story bubble to the top. There is a chapter in my book where a year before this trial started, Juan Martinez approached me on the street, telling me about a story that I was going to love, a case that I was going to love because it had all these nude pictures. That's what, that was my experience with the prosecutor months before this trial, and it sort of said to me that for whatever twisted reasons, we're going to decide that this case is worth millions. And to the family of what happened to Travis Alexander, that poor young man, it's a horrible crime. And I sat in that courtroom with his family, and you could see the anguish on their faces. So I don't want to diminish that, but again, in the grand scheme of things, there are a lot of horrific murders that don't get nearly that kind of attention or that kind of money. And I think it was for really sort of twisted at the bottom, at the end of the day, for a lot of really twisted reasons.
Well, so who does that reflect poorly on? Because I think it reflects poorly on like the average citizen, person, viewer of these stories, consumers of this content.
I say that you throw in people like Nancy Grace, who butted heads with her producers on multiple occasions. And I was there covering the story. I don't want anybody I'm not trying to be holier than thou. I'm in the thick of all of these fights, but I think that the impact of somebody like Nancy Grace on this case just created a sort of lunatic lynch mob that was outside the court much of the time, fired up and glorifying behavior in terms of the state and its case that I think were aberrant and destructive towards the legal process. And she's championing these things and firing up these lunatics outside the court.
And that kind of comes back to being on us, because that's driving ratings, right?
Totally.
So
we have only ourselves to blame.
Yeah. And then, so what is your stance on cameras in the courtroom?
I think cameras in the courtroom are a good idea.
Okay.
I think, at the end of the day, I think they're a good idea. You need a judge that will rein in aberrant behavior on the part of prosecutors and defense attorneys. I've seen them both. Watching clips from Richard Ramirez's trial back in the day, I can tell you that was as big a freak show as you're ever going to see. The pentagrams on the hand, the constant flirting with the women in the gallery. So, but I don't think. I think that generally, I would say cameras in the courtroom are a good idea. I think that transparency is always the best course.
Yeah. From the time you started reporting to the end of your career, have you seen a difference in your audience interest? True crime, it's not new. People keep saying it's so new, it's so popular. We've been obsessing about death for millennia, but centuries, you could say, in terms of infotainment. But you do have a specific niche of a career. Has viewer interest changed over those decades? Have you witnessed shifts?
I probably should have been more sensitive to those I've gone out and told the stories I wanted to tell. And unfortunately I've always found people that pay me to go to tell those stories or work for someone. So in terms of that, that's sort of, I'm not the guy that is monitoring social media to see what's trending. And even before there were such things, those are not the kinds of things that I have focused on, honestly. And, the Warren Jeff stuff was sort of self-motivated. I'm a very hyperactive person, so running out to a crime scene sort of comes naturally.
Yeah. It seems that way. If you were to get back on the field, like right now, what case or story would you want to cover?
Oh my goodness. I don't think the entire world is defined now on political divisions. So I'm not even sure. I'm glad in many ways I'm not doing that kind of stuff anymore. I felt lucky. I will honestly tell you, lucky. By the time I ended my career, I sort of felt like I had had a little piece of just about every kind of action.
Yeah.
And so I could walk away thinking, man, I miss it. And, to that regard, I feel honestly very lucky to be able to say that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great place to be. And I know you are, as in your words, hyperactive. So I know you still have energy and ideas, but you're retired from journalism. You wrote the book. What's keeping you busy now?
Well, the COVID has certainly sort of redefined all of our lives. I try to pick up a little acting work if I can along the way,
Yep.
But it certainly has been sort of curtailed. And, to walk my dogs and think about writing another book. And maybe looking for that story that would bring me back into the game.
Oh, very interesting. I hear a challenge. This has been really, really interesting. I could talk to you all afternoon, but I do want to make sure to point people to your book, which is Story Hustler, Murder, Mayhem, and PTSD. But Mike, before you go, I do ask all my guests before they leave, what is keeping you up at night?
Well, there's so many things we could choose from, but honestly, I'm not one of those kind of guys that tosses and turns and thinks about the boogeyman or the challenges up ahead. It's certainly not when I'm sleeping. I feel fortunate to be able to sit and lay down and occasionally catch a couple of winks and then get up and try to face what the real challenges are, not something in my head.
Good. I'm glad to hear that you sleep well after everything you've seen. I am. That's a good sign.
I'm not smart enough to be afraid, I think, most of the time.
I'll take your word for it. I like that theory. Well, thank you so much. I will link to the book to where people can get it. And thank you so much for being on Dialogue.
Thank you for your invitation, Rebecca. This has really been lovely and fun.
Thank you. Dialogue is a Yellow Tape Media production edited by Jason Usry and produced and hosted by me, Rebecca Sebastian. Please be sure to subscribe to Dialogue, a true crime conversation, wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across all platforms. You can also drop me a note or a guest suggestion or sign up for my newsletter at RebeccaSebastian.com. Be sure to join me every Wednesday for a new episode and another killer conversation.